Hi everyone, I'm Jenna Callahan from the Powassan Area Family Health Team, and welcome to the Mindfulness series. This video has a specific focus on depression and has some tips and tricks on how mindfulness can be beneficial for those who are experiencing depression. So onward we go. Since the beginning of the pandemic, reported cases of depression has more than doubled from about 4% to about 10%. Again, this is similar to the rates that I talked about in the anxiety video there. Um, Whereas this is just reported cases. We don't know what the actual numbers of depression may be throughout the course of the pandemic. And going forward, right, we have a lot of people experiencing isolation, not being able to socialize, maybe having health anxiety. Those things absolutely contribute to feelings of depression as well. We also have a lot of reoccurring statistics that indicate that if a person has one episode of depression, then they have a strong likelihood of having another episode of depression. So there is this like reoccurrence of people having depression multiple times throughout the course of their lives. And I think it's important to note as well that there is a really high comorbidity of depression and anxiety. So, what that means is that if you have depression, for example, you have about a 50-50 shot of also having anxiety as well. So that's kind of a really important thing to to recognize. So maybe also head over and look at the anxiety video as well. So when we're having experiences of depression, which is, I'm going to get into the symptoms a little bit right after this, but the low mood, that feeling of judgment towards ourselves, um, lacking motivation, that can also be paired with very anxious thoughts of excessive worry, huge problems with our thinking styles, and increase our stress response as well. So it's just always something to be mindful of. So here are the symptoms that I was talking about beforehand. And really, depression is defined as having a state of low mood, low interest, not a lot of pleasure in activities that we usually find enjoyable. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or as we just call it, the DSM, the criteria for depression includes fatigue, inability to concentrate, lack of memory, feelings of worthlessness or hopelessness, excessive guilt, and or suicidality. So those are kind of the symptoms, and then over like however long amount of time that it is, that's how someone could get a diagnosis of depression. A depressive mood, I know that sounds really strange, because depression, having a depressed mood, okay, like what does that mean? Really, what they're talking about is a mood that arises in the presence of stressors, and is really like the compounded factor of stresses. So, usually, how I like to define it is we know we have the fight or flight response, which is very highly correlated with anxiety, but there's also the freeze response. And this freeze response is just, bunkering down and hoping that it goes away and really just shutting ourselves down and kind of turtling inwards, um, and having very sad feelings associated as well. Just kind of this like giving up mentality. That's how I would depict what a depressed mood would be. I hope that clarifies that a little bit. Anhedonia as well. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but really that's what I was talking about earlier about that loss of interest or pleasure in activities. So really it's the things that used to give us joy, whether that was our hobbies, our friends, loved ones, those things aren't giving us the same like emotional response that they were before. And that's what kind of triggers us to not engage as much as we would have. So we have, of course, the loss of appetite, sleep difficulties, suicidality can come or go with depression. So I think it's important to note that you could have some of these symptoms and you could not have some of them as well. So I think it's important to note that you may not have all of these symptoms. to be experiencing depression. And with depression as well, I think it's important to talk about the like neurological changes. So, all the things that are kind of going on in our minds while this is happening. So, with someone who has a diagnosis of depression, there are very real neurological, like brain changes that are going on as well. It's not just, oh, I just don't feel like it today. And I just am gonna like give up. No, these are like very real things. So the two neurotransmitters in the brain that are important to remember are dopamine and serotonin. So, a decrease in dopamine is attributed to lack of motivation and a lack of ability to recognize rewards within the reward system of our brains, which is very interesting. So, why would we be feeling motivated if the same things that used to give us this like internal rewarding feeling are no longer giving that to us? And that's what dopamine is. It's kind of this like satisfying joy feeling. So that one's very important to depression. Um, the other one is serotonin, and this one has been linked to depression for a really long time. They're finding now that it's not as important as they used to think that it once was, because serotonin is in charge of our regulatory systems of our emotions. So basically, how we deal with ourselves and our emotions, everything that's going on internally. Um, so serotonin could actually decrease our ability to handle our own emotional responses, and our emotional capabilities as well. And that's marked by the start of our fight or flight response, or in this case, the freeze response as well. So I hope that that kind of normalizes the feelings that people do experience, or the lack of feelings that people do experience when they have depression. I've had bouts of depression myself, and how I usually characterize it to others, of course, it's different for everybody, is that it's kind of like brain fog. It's like I'm trying to see through a heavy fog to even complete the simplest of tasks. And we see that with people who have depression of not, being able to get out of bed, or not changing out of their pajamas, showering, brushing their teeth. Quite simple, what we would call self-care tasks, the things that keep us going day to day. People aren't being able to achieve those things, and they're not having the positive, rewarding feelings associated, as we know. So, this is where mindfulness comes in. Mindfulness is just the act of being present in the moment, being aware of thoughts, feelings, sensations, and the environment, um, and the acceptance of all that it is, just as it is. The goal of mindfulness is to have this state of concentration, onto a number of different things. There are visualizations, there's breathing, there's sounds as well, which is kind of like what we call the anchor is. That would be mine. I can listen to the noises of my house and my loved ones and my pets forever and ever. um, so, usually, mindfulness is a practice that increases awareness, which allows us to identify and understand thoughts and feelings that are coming in and out of our brains, and those that cause us some sort of distress as well, or some sort of dysfunctional behavior. So, that can be very beneficial for those of us who are experiencing depression, to be able to be here right now, and that's it. And be able to say, hey, I don't like that thought. I don't like calling myself bad names, or I don't like thinking about all my past regrets, or about how I'm not good enough, or how guilty I am, for not being enough. You know, those are those are good things to be mindful of. This is really what the focus on mindfulness for depression would be, is to focus on the non-judgment and bringing that back into place. And mindfulness is a really interesting kind of way in which we can guide ourselves within the world. Is that it doesn't have to be this sit down and like meditate kind of practice. That's actually probably the farthest thing, that it actually may be, but it can be the act of, you know, if you're bedbound, how does it feel to be underneath the sheets? What is the weight of the comforter that's above you, or the weight of the pillow, or the weight of your body on the bed? What does that feel like? Or when you're showering, what's the smell of your shampoo smell like? Um, or the feeling of the water, the temperature of your body and the water that's running onto it. Um, and the feeling of like lathering. So those are really good feelings that are just, like I said before, they're just in the moment. So yeah, the whole point of this mindfulness practice for depression would particularly be on the self-criticism and judgment and self-punishment that we give ourselves as well, for not being enough. Another goal of maintaining some sort of mindfulness practice would be to catch depression symptoms earlier on. So we know that depression has reoccurrent episodes. And if we're able to say, oh, hey, that's not, I'm having some really bad thoughts about myself, or I'm not really as interested in things as I once was. That could be us recognizing our own depression is coming on before it gets to such an extreme that it could be. There are really great guided meditations that are out there that are specifically for things like motivation or gratitude. Those two things, which are kind of opposing forces of the depressed parts of ourselves. Um, and I think that it's important to recognize for someone who is experiencing depression, mindfulness in all of its simplicity is an act of self care that requires very little of ourselves. It just requires us to kind of, be aware and slow down and stop. So it's a really good habit to get into just as an act of self care. If you don't feel like exercising, if you don't feel like going for walks, if you don't feel like doing this, that, and the other thing, mindfulness may be a really good option for you just to kind of start yourself off. And it can also help us by that motivation. It can also help us in reducing our own avoidance of doing things. Starting off really simply with just going outside, um, or socializing, which depression wants us to be very lonely. It thinks that we're not worthy of love or care, or friendship. So those thoughts can often be, they're not your true friends. They don't really care about you, or that, you're going to embarrass yourself and it's not worth trying. So mindfulness can be us recognizing, hey, that's not real, you know, and help us avoid avoiding, if that makes sense. So alongside this video somewhere is going to be a guided meditation specifically for depression. I did it myself. It's about 10 minutes long, and it's going to be really just about the simple gratitude and the simplicity of us accepting us wherever it is that we're at, even if that's depressed. Then we can accept ourselves as being depressed. Doesn't mean that we're going to be depressed forever. Just means that right now we don't feel good, and that's okay. So check that out if you're interested. There are also some really great resources. I'm always going to talk about these three apps: the Insight Timer, which is free, it's fantastic, the Headspace app or the Calm app. Headspace is also on Netflix. Or you can simply just, like, if you're just wanting to try it out for like 5-10 minutes, you can always just YouTube gratitude meditation or motivation meditation, meditation for depression, and see what comes up. Maybe something would be up there for you. The Mindful Way Through Depression, Freeing Yourself from Chronic Unhappiness, has really great authors. John Kabat-Zinn is actually recognized as kind of being the, I don't know, kind of the father of modern mindfulness, where he kind of took mindfulness, from that very like early on Buddhist practice and brought it into hospitals and researched it and showed that there is actually some very real positives associated. So he does great, great work. Um, and yeah, he's kind of like the guy. um, as well as, I'm not sure if these two are associated. I'm assuming that they are. There's the Mindful Way workbook, which could be paired with the Mindful Way Through Depression. And it's just the 8-week program of freeing yourself from depression and emotional distress. So that's something that's a little more like hands-on. It's not just something to read, it's something to practice. And finally, we have the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for depression, using acceptance and commitment therapy to move through depression and create a life worth living. Edition 2. So there's a first edition out there as well if you're looking for like a really cheap alternative as well. Usually there's not too much differences with editions. These are some really, really great resources, and I hope that this brings to you or anyone with experiences of depression to this awareness that it doesn't just have to be that way. It can be better. You can take charge of your own path, um, and try it out. So, thank you so much for listening, as always, and see you around, I suppose.